Hi everyone! I have decided to go ahead and plow through the rest of the chapters in How to Read a Book, The Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. I've already covered the first 3 stages of reading, so here's a quick recap. In Stage 1, elementary reading talks about learning to understand and comprehend passages at a middle school level. By the time someone enters high school, they should have mastered this level of reading, making it possible for them to read short passages, news stories, essays, articles about almost anything, as well as books that are written on a basic level. I'm not saying every high school student has mastered this level of reading, but in an ideal world, they would have. Stage 2 is inspectional reading, and that must be mastered to get a really good overview of a book, even a difficult book. Here you examine the book's title, subtitle, table of contents, and other parts of books such as introductions written by the author and the end matter. You're also expected to do a quick scan of the entire book. Time spent doing this preliminary work will help tremendously as you move on to Stage 3. And it's also fine to stop at Stage 2, inspectional reading, for any particular book if you decide for whatever reason that you don't want or need to read the entire book analytically or thoroughly. But if you really want to understand the book, you need to move on to Stage 3. And finally, Stage 3, analytical reading. There are 15 rules they give to keep in mind when doing a thorough analytical reading of a book. I'm going to read them to you just as a refresher. And as a reminder, I have covered all this material in more detail in other videos in the playlist below. If you want more in-depth coverage of these rules, then I suggest that you either borrow a copy of this book from your library or buy a copy to have to refer to yourself. Now, while analytical reading is one of the 4 stages of reading, they break this one down into 3 stages on its own. This is long and lengthy, and as I said, it's been covered in the videos below. I'm only covering it here with a very short recap for anyone who wants an overview. If you don't want to see this part, skip ahead. Some of you may notice that the author is referred to as a he in these rules. I'm using their exact rules. I'm not changing anything around. While this is no longer the correct convention, when Adler and Van Doren were writing this book in the early 70s, it was correct and prescribed. Anytime you didn't know the gender of a writer or any person when you were writing, you always used masculine pronouns. So here are the rules. Number 1, the first stage of analytical reading, rules for finding out what a book is about. And this bleeds a bit into inspectional reading as well. Number 1, classify the book according to the kind and subject matter. 2, state what the whole book is about with the utmost brevity. Number 3, enumerate its major parts in their order and relation and outline these parts as you have outlined the whole. And number 4, define the problem or problems that the author has tried to solve. And this last part is extremely important as you go forward. Stage 2, the second stage of analytical reading, are rules for interpreting a book's contents, and there are 4 of those as well, but they continue with their numbers. Number 5, come to terms with the author by interpreting his key words. Number 6, grasp the author's leading propositions by dealing with his most important sentences. Number 7, know the author's arguments by finding them in or constructing them out of sequences of sentences. And number 8, determine which of his problems the author has solved and which he has not, and of the latter, decide which the author knew he had failed to solve. The third stage of analytical reading are rules for criticizing a book as a communication of knowledge, and this is super important. It's divided into 2 separate sections. Section A is general maxims for intellectual etiquette. Rule 9, do not begin criticism until you have completed your outline and your interpretation of the book. Do not say you agree, disagree, or suspend judgment until you can say, I understand. Number 10, do not disagree disputatiously or contentiously. Don't just start out with the idea, I don't like this author, I don't like these ideas, so I don't agree, I don't care what he says. That's not acceptable in intellectual discussion. And number 11, demonstrate that you recognize the difference between knowledge and mere personal opinion by presenting good reasons for any critical judgment you make. I think a lot of our problems would be solved today if we just followed those 3 rules up right there. But then he goes on to section B, special criteria for points of criticism. Number 12, show wherein the author is uninformed. 13, show wherein the author is misinformed. 14, show wherein the author is illogical. Or 15, show wherein the author's analysis or account is incomplete. Now, of these last 4, the first 3 are criteria for disagreement. It's okay to disagree if you find in some way that the author is uninformed, misinformed, or illogical. But failing in all of these, you must agree at least in part. Although you can suspend judgment in light of the last point if you think the author's analysis is incomplete. Now, these are the general rules for reading most books. But in this chapter, and we're talking about how to read practical books here, they point out that there is no such thing as a general book. All books contain certain things in particular. So while most of these rules apply to some books, they might not apply at all to others. And this is why they created this entire next section of the book, Part 3, Approaches to Different Reading Matter. They want to examine which of these rules apply to different books. And in this chapter, they state that new rules they haven't covered yet will apply to some chapters to come, but not to all. And they say with practice, you will gradually get a feel for when to apply which rules, and you will get better at applying these with time. As with everything you set out to accomplish in life, practice makes perfect. Now, practical books fall under the category of nonfiction. More specifically, they are expository works, and as a review, expository works convey knowledge about specific topics. And they remind us that there are 2 types of expository works, practical and theoretical. And of course, today we're covering practical. Practical works lay out rules to accomplish something. They're action guides, and examples are cookbooks and auto repair manuals. Theoretical books give the background knowledge and principles on which these rules are based. Examples of theoretical books are economics books and political science books. They say very few books that are merely guides with only rules make great books, but many books that combine the rules with theoretical principles do make great books. In other words, a lot of practical books give both theoretical background for the rules and they explain the rules themselves. The primary example of this type of hybrid practical book, of course, is their own. Just from the rules above, you can see that they combine principles with rules. And how. Another example of this type of book might be books on living an ethical or a moral life. They will give you reasons why the rules they prescribe are important. They spend a lot of time explaining that no practical book can accomplish anything for you. For anyone to accomplish anything, they must lay down the book and do what it says. Well, yeah, I hope that makes sense. The rules should be stated as imperative sentences. In other words, you must do so-and-so, like this one. Combine the flour and the sugar before adding the wet ingredients. That's an imperative sentence, and rules are often stated in this format, so keep your eye open for those imperative sentences and make note of them because that's a rule. The principles that underlie the rules are often stated as declarative sentences. By combining the flour and sugar together before adding the wet ingredients, you will ensure that they are incorporated throughout the batter. Always try to separate principles from rules. And even if you are reading a book that uses theoretical knowledge, you can derive the rules even if they're not stated as an imperative. Let's look at that example above again. You can easily figure out that the best method, the rule, is to combine the flour and the sugar before adding the wet ingredients without being told explicitly to do so. So now let's change lanes here and move into something different. Should you just pick up any practical book and assume that because an author wrote it, they know what they're talking about? Should you assume that they're right and blindly follow their advice? I hope you answered no to that question because people have all sorts of crazy ideas, some of which, no matter how sincere the person that holds them might be, are false, and they can lead you into trouble. And sometimes they're convinced they're right, but later experience may convince even them that they're not. So how do you stop yourself from making a mistake by following bad advice? You determine for yourself what they want you to do and why. What's their end game? That's a good way to figure this out. Sometimes their arguments and rules are based solely on the end game. But do the ends always justify the means? No, of course, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And as a reader, it's your job to consider the author's propositions and decide, do you agree with them or not? They discuss this at length in the previous chapters on analytical reading. Any practical book hopes to persuade you that the author's methods are the ones you should follow. Keep that in mind whenever you read a book that proposes to teach you to do something. Two main questions you need to ask yourself when reading a practical book are, what are the author's objectives and what are the means for achieving them? At least, what are the means that the author is proposing to achieve them? If the objective the author is aiming for is how to achieve financial security, just for an example, that's good to know. It's good to know that that's what they want you to achieve. But if the means they suggest for achieving them is something like selling illegal drugs, that's good to know too. Then you can decide, in this case, would the means justify the objective of financial security? They say that every practical book is a mixture of emotional oratory and propaganda to convince you that the author is right. Every one. Propaganda tends to have a bad reputation today, but they say in this case, right or wrong, it's necessary. The duty of a writer is to convince you that they are right. That's what they're supposed to do. Otherwise, writing the book would be a waste of time. And this isn't always bad. Sometimes the author's right about things, and sometimes you do need to be convinced. The problem comes in when you're not aware of what they're doing. If you allow yourself to get swept away in their arguments without fact-checking or applying critical thinking, you open yourself up to false beliefs. And that can lead to trouble for you and for others. As they say on page 198, only hidden and undetected oratory is really insidious. What reaches the heart without going through the mind is likely to bounce back and put the mind out of business. Propaganda taken that way is like a drug you do not know you are swallowing. The effect is mysterious. You do not know afterward why you think or feel the way you do. But by following their guidance to pick out emotive words and phrases, then you know when the author is trying to persuade you. You can just see it. This gives you control over whether or not you agree. If you think over the arguments and you agree, that's fine. You've done your critical thinking, and your change in opinion is fine, even good, if it's based on reality as you understand it. But because the nature of practical books is to persuade you to follow a certain course, you also need to be aware of the author's background. Their life circumstances will color their assumptions and their arguments. So, here are the 4 main questions they say you need to answer when reading a practical book. Number 1, what is the book about? What problems are being solved and how does the author want you to solve them? Number 2, what are the author's terms, propositions, and arguments? In other words, how do they define words? What ideas are they setting forth and what arguments do they present to back up their ideas? And number 3, is it true? Does the ends the author seeks to justify the means they propose to get there? And do their ends and means agree with your conception of what is right? And number 4, finally, what of it? If you read a practical book, they say, and you agree with what the author is saying, listen to this carefully, then you're obligated to change your behavior and live according to the advice they've proposed. Now, I had no problem with anything they were saying up until that last part there, but I've agreed with many things I've read, and I still have not changed my behavior. And I'm sure sometimes you've done the same. Here's an example for me. I love to read spiritual books, and I agreed with what I read in the 4 arguments, but I couldn't manage to follow through on what he proposed. Intellectually, for example, I agree with the second agreement. Don't take things personally. It's nonsensical to take things that other people do personally. And yet, I still do it all the time. I take things personally, and it seems like I can't help it. And they do address this at the end of the chapter, and I will tell you why, according to them, I can't follow this advice. But they talk about other reasons people may not do what the author suggests as well, but it's a circular argument. It goes right back to what they were saying originally. First, they say either you really didn't agree with the author's propositions and arguments, or you didn't agree with the rules that supported those arguments. They give an example from their own book on page 201, paragraph 3. Let us give an example of what we mean. If after completing part 2 of this book, you, number 1, agreed reading analytically is worthwhile, and number 2, accepted the rules of reading as essentially supportive of that aim, then you must have begun to try to read in the manner we have described. If you did not, it is not because you were lazy or tired. It is because you did not really mean either number 1 or number 2. Here's another example they give, though. If you don't have the specialized knowledge to follow through on an author's suggestion, then you may not follow their advice. And I thought this was kind of funny. They give the perfectly reasonable example of a man. Picture a man reading a cookbook, and he finds a chocolate mousse recipe that he thinks looks absolutely delicious. They say he agrees it would work and be worthwhile, but he's not going to follow their advice because, of course, he doesn't know how to cook. He's a man. That would be as crazy as expecting a woman know how to follow plumbing advice. That's just silly. But seriously, the argument does hold water for a lot of things. I can be completely convinced that a manual I'm reading is the best way to build a rocket, but I don't have the specialized knowledge to construct one. And not to mention I don't have access to the raw materials, which is probably a good thing for everybody. But back to my problem in following one of the agreements in the 4 agreements. Don't take anything personally. The last reason they give for people not following practical advice that they agree is sound is because they have a psychological problem that prevents it. Well, that's a relief for me. I mean, here I was thinking that I don't have the convictions to follow through, or maybe I'm just lazy, but no. Having a psychological problem explains a whole host of things, doesn't it? So that's their specific advice on how to read practical books effectively. In our next video, we'll cover Chapter 14, How to Read Imaginative Literature. And I can hardly wait for that. Don't forget about my 2 books, Library Lens' curated collection of superlative nonfiction and Library Lens biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs. If you'd like great recommendations on all sorts of nonfiction topics and people. And if you're really feeling adventurous, you can give my paranormal women's fiction novel, The Robin's Nest, a try. It's a cozy paranormal story with feel-good vibes about a used bookstore located in the mythical and magical North Carolina mountain town of Whippoorwill Gap. And until next time, happy reading.